Welcome to UN Insider. I'm Elaine Reyes at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Join us as we delve into the world's most pressing issues and learn how the people inside work toward a better future for everyone around the world.
Coming up on UN Insider.
The situation in the Middle East is growing more dire by the hour. The war in Gaza is raging and risks spiraling throughout the region.
Urgent calls for a ceasefire as the fighting between Israel and Hamas intensifies and the humanitarian crisis worsens.
If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.
More than 7 decades of diplomacy. A look back at the UN's earliest days as the organization marks a milestone. Preserving cultural treasures. Meet some of the people working to restore a centuries-old landmark. Next.
For weeks, the Middle East has been the focus of global attention. Hamas's unprecedented attacks on Israel and Israel's retaliation have raised new concerns in a region already grappling with long-standing divisions. This week, the UN Security Council took up some of the pressing issues. Jody Jacobs has the details.
It was a tense session at the Security Council on Tuesday, its 4th meeting since the start of the war between Hamas and Israel.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing.
While pleading with the Council to protect civilians and UN staff and help end the violence, his comments and his overall speech didn't go down well with the Israeli delegation.
Obviously, our government will have to reassess our relations with the UN and its officials that are stationed in our region.
2 Security Council resolutions calling for an end to the conflict have already failed. The Palestinian Foreign Minister urged the Council to save lives, saying its continued failure was inexcusable.
Is it not the Security Council's duty to maintain international peace and security and preserving the principles and purposes of the UN Charter that have guaranteed to our peoples to save the generations from the scourge of war and taking these joint and effective measures to prevent the causes that threaten peace as per the principles of international law and justice? Or is it difficult for your Security Council to uphold its responsibility and its mandate and resolutions without selectivity or double standards?
This was a sentiment echoed by many Arab states. The US has put forward a new resolution which Russia says it will not support. China has urged Security Council members to unite around one resolution and to bring peace and stability in the region.
The draft is seriously out of balance and confuses right and wrong in terms of the approach. The draft was introduced in haste and lacked the consensus it deserved in terms of effectiveness. The draft does not reflect the world's strongest calls for a ceasefire and an end to the fighting, and it does not help to resolve the issue. Based on the above, the draft is evidently not in a position to be adopted.
China says the eyes of the world are on this chamber and decisive action needs to be taken sooner rather than later. Jody Jacobs, CGTN, New York.
Shu Deja is monitoring developments inside the halls of the United Nations. Deja.
Yes, Elaine, the Israeli-Hamas conflict entered its third week. Many things happened this week. We have two rival Security Council draft resolutions from the US and Russia. Both failed to be adopted. And we have the reconvening of the 10th ESS Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. And we have multiple foreign ministers, including Secretary of State Mr. Blinken here in this building to discuss the situation in the Middle East. The division is clear. Well, ultimately, it comes down to two issues. First, whether to start a ceasefire, and second, whether to emphasize the right to self-defend. These two questions would define what's going to happen in the next phase.
To those who voted against this resolution, I must say that your decision shocks me to my core. In Israel, we are fighting for our very survival. My elderly parents living in Ashkelon have spent the last 20 days running back and forth to their bomb shelters as rockets rain down on them, deliberately on them, on civilians. And you cannot condemn even these deliberate attacks on civilians perpetrated by terror organizations? If any of your countries endured a similar massacre, I am certain that you would act with much greater force than Israel. Much greater force. There would be no question in your minds that such a barbaric slaughter requires a broad military operation against the terrorists who committed such inhumane atrocities to eradicate their terrorist capabilities in order to make sure that such atrocities can never happen again. How would Moscow react if terrorist death squads wiped out entire neighborhoods in Moscow? How would Beijing respond if genocidal jihadis beheaded and murdered your babies? I will give you a moment to reflect on that thought. But I believe every person, not only here in this room, across the globe, whoever is watching this discussion, knows exactly how you would respond.
主席，我的话会很简短，我只是想说，尊敬的以色列常驻代表，
My distinguished PR of Israel,
在这里辩论，
having a debate with Israel
以色列
was
把
not
中国
my
当成
intention.
对手，
That Israel
错了对象。
treats China as a rival, either as a rival.
你应该明白，
You picked the wrong
从这
target,
轮巴以
probably.
一开始，
You should be aware that from the very start of this round of conflict between Palestine and Israel,
一切
China has unequivocally condemned all acts that harm civilians
国际法的行为
in，violation of
我
international
们所
law.
说的平民，
When we refer to
既包括
civilians,
巴勒斯
they
坦平民
include both
也包括
Palestinian
以色
civilians
列平民。
and those of Israel.
第二，你
Second,
就今天的决议发表
regarding
的
today's resolutions, you made some comments. I'd like to remind you that just last week, this council, there was a resolution before the council
攻击行为的决议，
which contained elements that
中国
condemned
投了赞成票，
condemned
这些决
Hamas
议
attacks.
遭到了
China voted in favor of the resolution. However, that resolution was
第
vetoed.
三，
Third,
我在刚才的发言当
in
中
my
明
earlier
确地提
statement,
到，
I made it
中国
abundantly
绝不
clear
是
that
否认以色列的安全国益。
China is
相
not
反，我们一直主张
denying Israel's
同等
legitimate
重视
concern.
以
However,
色列和巴
we
勒斯坦双
emphasize
方的安全
equal
关系
attention to the legitimate
合法
security
权利
concerns and legitimate rights of both Palestine and Israel in the current
我
circumstances
们在处理好这一轮
where
巴以冲突的
we try to
同时，我们
deal
不能否认
properly with this
巴勒
round
斯
of
坦人民的权利，
the conflict between Palestine and Israel. We cannot
没有
deny
得
that
到根本的保障。
the rights of the Palestinian people have for a very long time not been properly guaranteed, and the only way out, we believe, is the two-state solution, but that has not been properly
诚实的态度，
settled. So
尊重事实，
let's be frank, let's be honest, face
通
up
过
to
我们
facts,
共同努力，
and
既解决
put
好
aside
当前的问题，
differences and join forces to handle well the prevailing issues, and also to chart a path whereby both Palestinians and Israelis can live in harmony, tranquility, peace, and happiness.
But the most shocking news was that the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Gilad Erdan, asked the Secretary General of the United Nations to apologize or resign because of his statement in the Security Council.
The UN is failing, and you, Mr. Secretary General, have lost all morality and impartiality. Because when you say those terrible words that these heinous attacks did not happen in a vacuum, you are tolerating terrorism. And by tolerating terrorism, you are justifying terrorism. Hamas, as the minister explained, beheaded babies, burned families, raped women, abducted kids, babies, Holocaust survivors. And the SG is blaming the victim? You are blaming Israel? This is a pure blood libel. This is a pure blood libel, and I think that the Secretary General must resign.
I am shocked by the misrepresentations by some of my statement yesterday in the Security Council, as if I was justifying acts of terror by Hamas. This is false. It was the opposite. In the beginning of my intervention yesterday, I clearly stated, and I quote, "I have condemned unequivocally the horrifying and unprecedented 7 October acts of terror by Hamas in Israel. Nothing can justify the deliberate killing, injuring, and kidnapping of civilians or the launching of rockets against civilian targets." End quote. Indeed, I spoke of the grievances of the Palestinian people. And in doing so, I also clearly stated, and I quote, "But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas." End quote. And then I went on with my intervention referring all my positions on all aspects of the Middle East crisis. I believe it was necessary to set the record straight, especially out of respect to the victims and to their families.
Like the spokesperson of the UN Secretary General said, this is just the opinion of one member state and there is no consideration of the resignation of the Secretary General. The UN and Israel relationship now is kind of deteriorating. What would that impact the humanitarian operation in Gaza, as well as your communication with the Israeli part?
I mean, I think you're jumping, you're extrapolating in a way. I spoke to my colleagues in Jerusalem this morning. They continue to have contacts at all levels with their Israeli counterparts, whether in government, with the military, and those contacts are continuing.
Now, with the General Assembly emergency special session, with 4 failed Security Council draft resolutions, with tough words from Israeli ambassador to the UN, and more importantly, with the upcoming ground operation of Gaza unfolding, we really don't know what's going to happen, and we will see. Elaine.
Shudija, thanks. "78 years of international cooperation." On October 24th, 1945, the United Nations Charter was ratified and the organization officially came into existence. Here's a look at the evolution of this unique institution.
June 1945. World War II, the deadliest military conflict in human history, was drawing to a close, and world leaders were looking for a pathway to peace. Representatives of 50 countries gathered together to work out a plan, flocking to the US city of San Francisco from across the globe.
Conference of the United Nations on International Organization is now convened.
Though the United Nations was the brainchild of US President Franklin Roosevelt, it was his successor, Harry S. Truman, who addressed representatives at the first UN conference.
If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.
And after months of drafting the UN Charter, on October 24, 1945, the United Nations came into existence. Now headquartered in New York City, the UN is tasked with a host of responsibilities. 87,000 peacekeepers in 12 operations around the world, and delivers supplies to those who need them most. Addressing a UN Security Council meeting on the Middle East earlier, Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stressed the importance of global unity.
Today is United Nations Day, marking 78 years since the UN Charter entered into force. That charter reflects our shared commitment to advance peace, sustainable development, and human rights. On this UN Day, at this critical hour, I appeal to all to pull back from the brink before the violence claims even more lives and spreads even further.
It's a message he hopes will translate to every member state. It's a dramatically different world to that of 1945, with old priorities and concerns giving way to new ones. Some critics warn the United Nations needs to reform or risks being confined to history. But its advocates believe the UN has the power to create a more peaceful future. Sally Patterson, CGTN, New York.
What should the future hold for the UN? We asked Pakistan's ambassador, Munir Akram, about how effective the organization is now and how he would like to see it change going forward.
I think the importance of the United Nations is well proven. Despite its deficits and its failures, the United Nations is an essential organization. The weakness of the UN is there is no mechanism to be able to agree on international security action when there is disagreement between the permanent 5 members of the Council. We have to find a way to overcome that. We do not think that the way to overcome is by adding new permanent members. We think that the Security Council must become more democratic, that is the voice of the small and medium-sized countries who are the majority in the United Nations must be more represented on the Security Council. And through that, we shall have greater democracy, greater accountability of the Security Council, and greater effectiveness in addressing issues such as we are facing today in Gaza.
For decades, the world has been fighting HIV and AIDS, but an end to the epidemic could finally be in sight. Winnie Byanyima is the UN Undersecretary General and the Executive Director of UN AIDS. Ms. Byanyima, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You appeared recently here in New York at the Clinton Global Initiative, and you had a message, and it was a message of encouragement that if we can stay the course, that we can end HIV infections by 2030. For some, that may sound somewhat ambitious, but it is a very optimistic message. And so I want you to tell us, how did we get to this point, and why are you so encouraged?
25 years ago, the world came together here at the United Nations and agreed. It was at the height of HIV, AIDS killing people. And they agreed as governments to come together and fight this together. They made a plan, they set targets, and every 5 years, they've met renewed targets. And here we are, 30 million people who are living with HIV are on treatment today and living good lives around the world. And that's the result of global solidarity. Rich countries put money down. Rich countries put money into companies to innovate and find the treatment. The treatment was costly at first. People living with HIV rose, fought hard, and companies were then pushed to share the technology. Generics were made. Now everyone, and prices came down, and everyone has what they need. We still have a way to go, though. 9 million people are still not on treatment. We're still pushing to get there.
Now, you have said that one of your big concerns right now is that there are so many crises around the globe that this issue might be dropping off the agenda a bit, just as you're starting to make progress and headway. What needs to be done to make sure that that doesn't happen and this issue remains at the forefront?
So we at UNAIDS are making this argument, and that's why we are here at this meeting of the General Assembly Summit of Heads of State. We are saying that fighting or working to end HIV/AIDS is preparedness for future pandemics. That the investment you make to fight HIV/AIDS today, all the things you do to stop infections, to stop deaths, the systems you build, the people you empower with capacities, all of that is what you will use to prevent a future pandemic or to respond if you're hit by it. So that's one. Two, also, when we fight HIV/AIDS, the things we do to protect against infection are also the things that achieve the other SDGs. Take, for example, in Africa, we know that girls and young women are the most vulnerable to have highest risk to get HIV. We know that the solution to that lies in, one, keeping girls in school, at least up to the end of secondary school. When you do that, you don't only reduce the risk of HIV, you reduce the rate of teenage pregnancies, you reduce early marriage rates, you reduce the incidence of sexual violence, you also increase growth and you get a higher income for your country because you have women who are empowered.
Ms. Winnie Byanyima, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, too, for having me.
Brazil is one of the world's most diverse ecosystems. More than 120,000 animal and plant species can be found in the country. Protecting and preserving that biodiversity can be a daunting task, but international efforts are making a difference. Joel Richards has the details.
In the Sao Paulo state in southern Brazil, Mauricio Rodrigues checks on his bees.
Tá quase operculando, tá quase pronto de tirar.
He says this honey is almost ready to harvest. 63-year-old Rodrigues has been a beekeeper all his life. It runs in the family. He's the third generation to make honey. But a number of years ago, he saw his livelihood threatened.
We had a big problem a few years ago here with the growth of sugarcane production in the region. Plain spraying pesticide was killing all the bees.
Brazil is the world's largest producer of sugarcane, but bees are vital for ensuring and preserving local biodiversity.
If we didn't have bees, 80% of all fruit and vegetables would not be here. We would not be here on Earth.
Matteo Tripoli oversees Project Pollinate, run by China's largest agricultural company, COFCO. It's an initiative aimed to protect local bee colonies. Tripoli explains that bees can fly around 1.5 kilometers from their hive in search of food.
So we drew up a buffer zone around the apiary, where we do not use chemical pesticides, only biological pesticides.
This company uses satellite mapping to draw up a radius around the bee colonies. This data is then sent to pilots who install the information in their plane's computer before applying pesticide. After tests and calibration, spraying automatically stops when the plane crosses into the buffer zone. This pilot explains they work to margins of error of around 40 centimeters. COFCO has invested over $2 billion in Brazil since 2014. The company says it places high priority on sustainability.
It is often said that Brazil is the world's breadbasket. It is a country that has the potential to supply food for the world at a time when there is a growing demand for food, a crisis in food security, and a lack of food in some regions. What we have to do, and always keep in mind, is that we can only do that by preserving what we have.
Over 50 apiaries are included in Project Pollinate, and it may serve as an example for conservation projects in other regions and for other crops. Meanwhile, Mauricio Rodriguez continues to make honey at his farm. Joel Richards for CGTN, São José de Rio Preto, Brazil.
Cambodia is home to one of the most recognizable archaeological sites in the world. The Angkor Wat temples have stood for centuries, but as Wu Bin shows us, it has taken decades to restore and preserve the UNESCO World Heritage Site.
This is Angkor Wat, the world's largest religious complex. The Angkor Archaeological Park represents the highest achievements of the Khmer Empire, dating from the 9th to 15th centuries. But due to heavy rains, looting, and lack of protection for centuries, most Angkor temples were seriously damaged. In 1993, China became one of the first countries to join the International Action for Safeguarding Angkor, launched by Cambodia and UNESCO. The work officially started from Chauset Tavoda back in 1998 by a joint team called the China-Cambodia Government Team for Safeguarding Angkor, or CCSA. The temple is not large compared to other Angkor relics, but it was one of the most difficult to repair. 8 of the 9 buildings were severely damaged by the time the operation was launched.
针对周刹神庙，它呢主要是大量的这种石构件。
The difficulty in restoring Chauset Tavoda with the 4,000 elements from the temple found lying around the site, so we proposed that first we needed to rescue and reinforce them, at the same time strengthening the protection of the site and putting large amounts of pieces in their original place.
构件能够复位修复上去。
So this is the South Library of Chauset Tavoda, and it appears to be complete. You can actually see a lot of details around here, but let me show you a picture before restoration. You can tell really what it is. And after a decade of efforts, the site was restored in 2008 and started to welcome tourists once again. In 2010, 2 years after the completion of the Chauset Tavoda project, the team began restoring the Takeo Temple, one of the most majestic and distinctive of all Angkor monuments.
We formed our principles and standards during the work on Chauset Tavoda and the Takeo Temple. For example, the principle of minimal intervention and reversibility. These have been recognized and spread by local authorities and the expert team of the ICC Angkor.
With the successful restoration of the 2 projects, the Cambodian government officially handed over the ruined royal palace, the most central part of Angkor Thom, to the Chinese team in 2018.
The royal palace is an important historic relic. It was built in the late 11th century and is even older than Angkor Thom.
The main body is still under survey, and latest technologies, including AI, will be used to locate fallen bricks.
After completing the restoration work, the Cambodian people and people around the world will see the royal palace with their own eyes. I thank the Chinese government for studying and restoring the site.
The restoration of the royal palace site is expected to be completed in 2030, but this won't be the last job of its kind, as China is committed to joining hands together with other countries to protect historical treasures. We'll be CGTN at the worldly renowned Angkor Archaeological Park in Cambodia.
I'm Elaine Reyes at UN headquarters in New York. Thanks for being a UN Insider.